I am Inspector, and I solve mystery. Welcome to my new case.
The rain had been working itself into Oxford stone since tea time, that particular November persistence that transforms weather into atmosphere. In the Eagle and Child, where conversations settle like sediment and the air carries the comfortable fatigue of centuries, I found myself beneath Turner's reproduction, a seascape where crimson bled through storm clouds with the inevitability of memory, through consciousness. The painter had understood something about red that eluded lesser minds. It was never merely color, but the visual embodiment of endings, passion, the pigment of things that refused to fade quietly. My crossword lay half-conquered on the scarred oak table, its grid a battlefield where ink had won some territories and erasure others. 6 across taunted me with deliberate opacity. Painter's medium, eternally red, 6. I had attempted the usual dismantlings. Medium as average, as spirit as substance, eternally as endless, red as flag or flush or political inclination. None would surrender to logic, that stubborn clue sitting like a burr beneath thought's surface. Through diamond-paned windows, students hurried past with scarves pulled mercilessly tight, their faces bright with the particular urgency of those who mistake motion for progress. The amber light caught their movements, transforming them into figures from some medieval manuscript, illuminated, fleeting, unconscious of the beauty through which they moved. Oxford in November consents to melancholy without theatrics, its Gothic verticals and medieval horizontals naked against a sky that promises nothing but delivers everything. She entered as the light was failing, shaking rain from dark wool with movements that spoke of precision rather than haste. Dr. Eliza Hartwell. I remembered her from a lecture series on illuminated manuscripts, though doubted she would recall one detective among the academic faces. She possessed that particular composure of women who navigate male-dominated territories without surrendering essential grace, ordering wine with the quiet confidence of someone long reconciled to solitude. Her choice of table near the window revealed calculation rather than chance. From a leather portfolio, something that had suffered beautifully before becoming useful, she extracted what appeared to be photographs of manuscript pages. Her fingers bore the telltale stains of those who work with ancient texts, not ink, but something deeper, as though centuries had seeped through skin into bone. She leaned forward with devotional attention, making notes with a silver pen that caught the failing light like trapped moonbeams. The evening paper lay abandoned beside my elbow, its headlines promising the usual litany of failures and small triumphs. But page 7 held something more intriguing. Renaissance Revelations. Magdalen College unveils newly discovered illuminated manuscripts. The exhibition would open next week, featuring texts emerged from private collection, their authenticity verified through months of painstaking analysis. Medieval scholars were calling it the find of the decade, that particular academic hyperbole that usually masks something genuinely significant. The crossword clue continued its quiet torment until understanding arrived with the suddenness of grace. Medieval painters had drawn their crimson from many sources, but one endured above all others, the root of the madder plant, ground and mixed to create a red that outlasted empires. Madder, 6 letters, eternally red, the pigment that had colored everything from Roman togas to Renaissance tapestries. I filled the squares with satisfaction, that small intellectual triumph warming me more than the bitter. Dr. Hartwell sipped her wine, Burgundy, from the way she held the glass, without lifting her gaze from photographs that seemed to hold her in conversation with vanished centuries. There was something almost liturgical in her attention, as though she were reading prayers written in gold leaf and vermilion. My phone's insistent ring cut through the pub's comfortable murmur like conscience through complacency. Lewis's voice carried that familiar note of apologetic urgency. There had been a death at Magdalen College, he explained. Suspicious circumstances, a fellow found in the rare books library among illuminated manuscripts. I glanced toward Dr. Hartwell's table, but she had vanished, leaving only the faint impression of her presence and the lingering scent of rain-dampened wool. The turner above me bled its ancient reds toward copper, and I thought unhelpfully of how color outlives almost everything. Pigment ignores genealogies, while small saints' wounds glow more faithfully than any vow. Rain followed us across Magdalen Bridge like a persistent scholar, tapping questions against ancient stone, whispering through the college gates where centuries of secrets had learned to keep themselves. The porter led us through corridors that breathed with institutional memory, past windows where diamond panes caught the night's last reluctant gleam. In the rare books library, silence possessed weight, not mere absence of sound, but something denser, more reverent, the accumulated quiet of knowledge preserved against time's patient erosion. Dr. Simon Blackwood had arranged himself for eternity with unconscious dignity. 63 years of academic pursuit had carved deep furrows around intelligent eyes, now closed against whatever final revelation had overtaken him. His body slumped in the high-backed chair as if reconsidering some scholarly argument, left hand still clutching a magnifying glass, while his right had fallen across an open manuscript whose colors seemed to pulse with unnatural vitality in the subdued lighting. But the wall commanded attention with the insistence of a scream in a cathedral. A vivid streak of red paint slashed across medieval stone like a wound opened in the building's flesh. Too bright for accident, too deliberate for vandalism. The mark possessed an intentionality that transformed damage into message, crimson that seemed almost wet, though my fingers confirmed hours of drying. The paint's direction suggested a left-handed gesture or right-handed awkwardness, the kind of detail that whispers when everything else shouts. Lewis approached with that careful deference he reserved for scenes that defied immediate comprehension. Nothing appeared disturbed, he observed, his voice carrying the particular disappointment of those who prefer their mysteries to announce themselves clearly. No signs of struggle, no valuable texts disturbed in their climate-controlled cases. The college porter, summoned from evening rounds, confirmed that Blackwood had requested emergency access at 10 o'clock, standard procedure for senior fellows conducting after-hours research. The manuscript itself demanded examination with the authority of evidence that refuses interpretation. Open to a page depicting the martyrdom of Saint Sebastian, the illumination showed the saint pierced with arrows, his wounds rendered in the same intense crimson that now marked the wall. Medieval painters had possessed secrets we had forgotten, methods of mixing pigments that achieved effects modern chemistry struggled to replicate. Each droplet of painted blood seemed to catch light independently, creating an almost three-dimensional effect that made the ancient page appear disturbingly alive. When Dr. Hartwell arrived, she carried professional composure like carefully fitted armor, though something fragile flickered behind her scholarly mask. She explained that Blackwood had contacted her that afternoon, claiming discovery of inconsistencies requiring immediate consultation. His excitement had been palpable, she said, though her voice carried undertones that suggested more complexity than routine authentication procedures. She approached the reading desk with movements that spoke of familiarity with precious things, fingers hovering above the manuscript's surface without quite touching. The tremor in her hands was barely perceptible, but in someone whose profession demanded absolute steadiness, any deviation became significant. She identified the work as a previously unknown example of the Flemish school, possibly worth hundreds of thousands if properly authenticated. But when I mentioned the red mark on the wall, her gaze slid away with studied casualness. She positioned herself to avoid looking directly at the crimson streak, suggesting knowledge she preferred not to acknowledge. The way she closed the manuscript, with reverent care but unmistakable haste, spoke of duties more pressing than professional curiosity. In the library's ledger, Blackwood's entry recorded his arrival at 2212, handwriting that believed in its own authority. Below it, a faint pressure mark suggested another entry begun and abandoned, the kind of hesitation that reveals more than completion ever could. Albatio's microscopic smudge of red marked the page corner, not where fingers would naturally rest, but where a thumb might brush while reconsidering a name. The manuscript's binding showed recent disturbance, microscopic fragments of modern adhesive indicating repair work. Someone had been examining this text extensively, and recently. In the margin beside St. Sebastian's tortured form, barely visible pencil notation read, "Sanguine, true or false?" The handwriting matched Blackwood's scattered notes, but the question seemed to reference something beyond artistic technique. As we departed, leaving the library to its ancient quietude, I thought of my crossword solution. Mera, that eternal red pigment outlasting empires. Someone had chosen modern crimson to speak beside a dead man, and choice, in my experience, always reveals more than accident permits. Academic communities possess their own gravitational laws, drawing intellects into orbits where collaboration and competition generate particular heat. The morning found us navigating Magdalen's corridors, where centuries of institutional memory breathed through stone and timber, each footstep echoing against the accumulated weight of scholarly ambition. Professor Margaret Ashford received us in her study with the practiced grace of one who had learned to manage crises without acknowledging their existence. Her silver hair caught light filtering through mullioned windows as she spoke of recent tensions within the medieval manuscripts department, her words carrying diplomatic weight earned through decades of academic politics. There had been disagreements, she conceded, though nothing beyond the usual scholarly discourse that accompanied significant discoveries. Dr. Blackwood had possessed strong opinions about authentication procedures, and not everyone appreciated his increasingly rigid standards. Her fingers traced the rim of a porcelain teacup as she spoke, nervous energy carefully contained beneath institutional composure. When she mentioned departmental harmony, her voice carried the particular inflection of those who mistake repetition for truth. A letter lay half-folded on her desk. Arrangements, thanks. The dreary governance of generosity, she explained. But its watermark showed Pemberton Hall in ornate script, and the date referenced Tuesday's access, though Tuesday had not yet arrived. She misremembered Yeats as Eliot, calling the center a stubborn thing that nonetheless ought to hold, her correction arriving like an umbrella opened after the downpour had passed. Dr. James Whitmore inhabited his office like someone still surprised to find himself there, surrounded by books not yet properly arranged. 35 years old with the particular intensity of those who mistake ambition for passion. He spoke of Blackwood with that complex mixture of admiration and resentment that characterizes academic hierarchies. The older man had recently authenticated several manuscripts that would transform the college's reputation, work that should have been collaborative but had become increasingly solitary. His voice carried professional jealousy, wrapped in scholarly concern, the kind of emotion that ferments in institutional silence. On his desk, a visitor's parking permit for last month curled like dried leaf, though he professed to cycle everywhere. Mrs. Catherine Morse, no relation, though the coincidence amused us both, received us in the climate-controlled hush where the college's treasures sleep. As head librarian, she had observed Blackwood's research habits with the particular attention of those responsible for preserving knowledge against human enthusiasm. His recent obsession had centered on something he called the Crimson Codex, a legendary manuscript supposedly created by medieval monks who had mixed actual blood with traditional pigments. Most scholars dismissed such tales as romantic mythology, she explained, but Blackwood had become convinced that several recently acquired texts showed evidence of such techniques. Her office smelled of old paper and careful preservation, that particular atmosphere where knowledge ages like wine. She mentioned his late-night research sessions with expressions that suggested concerns beyond mere library security, noting how his desk had been accreting notes like lichen, pages salted with Latin abbreviations, even he sometimes misread. In the ledger, one entry had been rubbed nearly smooth as though someone had attempted to efface an impatience already recorded. Dr. Hartwell maintained professional distance with the determination of someone protecting more than reputation. In the manuscript conservation laboratory, she examined illuminated texts through magnification that transformed medieval artistry into landscapes of individual brush strokes. Her responses carried the precision of prepared statements, though her intimate knowledge of Blackwood's research methods suggested collaboration beyond mere professional courtesy. She described his shorthand, his favored cross-lighting techniques, his habit of penciling abbreviations for vermilion and lake in manuscript gutters before erasing them with his sleeve. Details that arrived before I asked, like confessions seeking absolution. Marcus Bellwether occupied temporary space in the laboratory's corner with the uncertainty of someone unsure of his welcome. His chemical analysis equipment seemed almost intrusive among medieval treasures, modern science interrogating ancient artistry with uncomfortable directness. When discussing pigment analysis work, nervous energy manifested in rapid speech and fidgeting hands scrubbed theatrical pink, though reddish dust had settled into the crescent beside his thumbnail, too persistent for soap, too honest for theater. His clipboard showed yesterday's date crossed through and rewritten, merely clerical, he insisted, though his voice lifted with the inflection of those who wish their sentences to become questions. Each conversation revealed layers beneath Oxford's scholarly surface, intellects shaped by academic pursuit, now orbiting secrets they preferred not to name. In the spaces between carefully chosen words, I sensed currents of passion and rivalry that transcended professional disagreement, emotions that transform knowledge into weapon and scholarship into battlefield. The forensic laboratory possessed that particular sterility where science strips mystery to its molecular components, transforming intuition into evidence with the ruthless precision of spectral analysis. The report arrived with morning light filtering through institutional windows, its findings both illuminating and deeply troubling. The red paint contained genuine medieval pigments, cinnabar ground from mercury sulfide, madder lake extracted from ancient roots, yet bound with modern acrylic polymers that belonged to no medieval palette. Someone had married authentic materials to contemporary techniques, creating a temporal paradox, painted in crimson, a bridge between centuries that spoke of knowledge both profound and deliberately corrupted. Blackwood's office surrendered its secrets with the reluctance of a confessional forced open. Beneath the apparent chaos of academic accumulation lay methodical purpose, filing systems that possessed their own archaeological logic. Hidden within routine correspondence, I discovered leather-bound notebooks containing microscopic photographs of manuscript pages, each annotated with cryptic abbreviations that protected dangerous knowledge from casual observation. His private code emerged through patient examination. Latin contractions compressed into shorthand where aurum became A, vermilion contracted to V, while suspicious entries earned the notation Fa falsus authenticus, false authentic. A contradiction that captured the essence of sophisticated deception, the notebooks revealed systematic investigation rather than casual scholarship. Blackwood's growing suspicion documented in handwriting that grew increasingly agitated as evidence accumulated. 3 manuscripts bore his damning designation, works whose authentication had elevated Magdalen's reputation while concealing fundamental fraud. His marginalia told stories of late-night testing, unauthorized analysis, a solitary crusade against deception waged in the shadows of institutional trust. Question marks multiplied like doubt made visible, exclamation points punctuating discoveries he had shared with no one, building toward a confrontation that had ultimately cost him his life. On his desk, preserved like archaeological evidence, lay a crossword puzzle whose grid bore witness to his final intellectual exercise. 8 across remained incomplete. Sanguine. the clue reading optimistic about bloodshed. I completed the word with growing comprehension. Sanguine, that treacherous crossing where language indulges its taste for irony. Cheerfulness forever stained by blood. The same word that described both hopeful temperament and the red-brown pigment medieval painters had created from iron oxide and organic compounds. The color of dried blood and faded hope. Optimism corrupted by violence. Lewis's investigation into college finances revealed the practical stakes that transformed academic dispute into mortal danger. The recently authenticated manuscripts had increased Magdalen's endowment by nearly £2 million, their scholarly validation generating donations that flowed like spring tide toward institutional coffers. Insurance valuations had been updated repeatedly, each assessment confirming growing worth as authentication procedures blessed their authenticity with academic imprimatur. The college's development office had leveraged the collection's reputation to attract additional benefactors, creating cycles where scholarly credibility generated fiscal reward, making questions about authenticity threats to more than reputation. The red paint on the library wall assumed profound significance when viewed through medieval practice. Illuminated manuscripts had indeed incorporated blood into their pigments, not merely as binding agent, but as symbolic element connecting artistic creation to spiritual sacrifice. Someone familiar with such traditions had chosen crimson deliberately, creating a message that would resonate with scholars while remaining opaque to casual observers. The streak spoke of authenticity violated and trust betrayed, medieval wisdom perverted to serve contemporary greed, painted with materials that honored ancient techniques while serving modern deception. Understanding crystallized with the slow inevitability of chemical reaction. The killer possessed intimate knowledge of medieval practices and access to authentic materials, expertise that transcended amateur enthusiasm. They understood Blackwood's research methods sufficiently to anticipate his discoveries, and they commanded technical knowledge adequate to create forgeries that had deceived experienced authenticators. Most significantly, they had chosen violence that honored historical tradition while serving personal purpose. Murder disguised as natural death, marked with pigment that proclaimed both authenticity and deception in the same crimson stroke. In that sterile laboratory, surrounded by equipment that reduced art to molecular formulae, I contemplated the peculiar tragedy of scholarship corrupted by ambition, knowledge transformed into weapon, expertise meant to preserve cultural heritage perverted into tool for fraud and murder. Lady Victoria Pemberton inhabited her Georgian mansion with the particular grace of those who understand that wealth, like reputation, requires constant curation to survive its own entropy. The house breathed old money through every carefully preserved detail, yet I have never trusted dwellings that appear perfectly complete. Absence leaves its outline more honestly than presence ever could. On the drawing room sideboard, pale crescents in the polish marked where silver epergnes had once anchored conversations, while cabinet shelves displayed velvet indentations that outnumbered their remaining occupants. Sotheby's correspondence lay half-concealed beneath country life, watermarks ghosting through expensive paper when tilted toward autumn light filtering through mullioned windows. She received us with that practiced charm which aristocracy deploys like expensive armor, speaking of Magdalen's medieval collection with genuine warmth, while her fingers traced porcelain rims with nervous precision. The donated manuscripts had transformed the college's reputation, she explained, her voice carrying satisfaction that transcended mere philanthropic duty. Yet when Lewis, who has never pretended to appreciate taste except in beer, raised questions about endowments and valuations, her responses arrived too rehearsed, gratitude mistaking repetition for sincerity. Financial records revealed systematic liquidation disguised as stewardship, paintings sold through discreet channels, jewelry converted to capital, even family silver sacrificed to maintain appearances while funding increasingly generous donations. Lady Pemberton was performing elegant alchemy, transforming inherited wealth into contemporary relevance while solving immediate fiscal pressures through charitable necessity. The scale of her generosity exceeded her liquid assets by margins that spoke of desperation dressed as virtue. Dr. Whitmore's confession emerged in a small cafe chosen for anonymity, his honesty contorting itself around uncomfortable truths. He admitted to closeness with Lady Pemberton that exceeded footnotes and acknowledgments. Companionship, he said, then corrected himself to friendship, finally leaving the word unfinished, which revealed more than any completed sentence. When discussing the manuscript's authentication, he used we. When mentioning Blackwood's investigation, he said he. Pronouns betray loyalties more reliably than oaths, and his had been compromised by emotions that transformed professional judgment into personal allegiance. In his office, evidence of divided attention scattered across surfaces like archaeological layers, technical assessments dissolving into marginalia that belonged to lover rather than scholar. A photograph tucked between manuscript pages showed Lady Pemberton in her library before the donation, surrounded by treasures whose authenticity I was beginning to question. The image had been taken from angles suggesting intimate access, knowledge of private spaces that spoke of relationships transcending professional consultation. Bellwether's laboratory analysis provided disturbing confirmation wrapped in scientific objectivity. 3 manuscripts glowed under ultraviolet examination where they should have slept, modern adhesives fluorescing with cheerfulness quite contrary to their purpose. Artificial aging had been applied with sophisticated understanding, gelatine sizing where medieval hands would have used rabbit skin glue, craquelure patterns too regular for natural deterioration. Someone possessing intimate knowledge of both historical techniques and contemporary chemistry had invested considerable effort in creating forgeries capable of surviving scholarly examination, at least until subjected to Blackwood's increasingly rigorous analysis. The Development Office confirmed what numbers had already suggested. Authentication of Lady Pemberton's gifts had coincided with pleasant inflation in the college's endowment, correspondence praising her vision in paragraphs that mistook gratitude for evidence. In the registrar's folder, a visitor's parking permit bore her name with validity for evening access, and on its reverse, Whitmore's notation, 10 p.m. library. Courtesy becomes habit before transforming into alibi. Yet something nagged like an unresolved chord. The emerging pattern suggested Lady Pemberton had been selling authentic pieces privately while donating sophisticated forgeries to maintain philanthropic reputation. Elegant deception requiring accomplices with technical expertise and access to authentication procedures. If Blackwood threatened exposure, academic scandal might damage reputations but hardly justified murder, unless deeper motivations lay concealed beneath apparent explanations. I recalled the red streak on the library wall, that deliberate mark requiring knowledge too intimate for mere financial fraud. The same mind capable of creating such sophisticated forgeries possessed understanding of medieval practices that transcended commercial motivation, expertise that could transform scholarly fraud into matters of life and death. Outside, rain returned to Oxford through familiar channels, and I contemplated how noble intentions corrupt themselves, philanthropy becoming theft, generosity perverted into mechanisms for preserving appearances, while sacrificing truth itself. Academic limbo possesses its own geography, inhabited by those brilliant minds whose temperaments proved too unstable for institutional comfort. Thomas Aldrich emerged from departmental whispers like guilt made manifest, his name spoken in corridors with that particular inflection reserved for cautionary tales. The graduate records revealed his trajectory with bureaucratic precision. 3 years of exceptional scholarship followed by accusations that transformed promise into exile. His dismissal from Blackwood's research team 6 months earlier, generating paperwork that spoke in institutional euphemisms about irregularities and concerns. His former colleagues described genius curdling into obsession, intellectual gifts perverted by rejection and wounded pride. Aldrich had possessed intuitive understanding of medieval techniques that transcended mere scholarship, approaching artistry through chemistry with devotional intensity. His doctoral thesis on pigment analysis had been rejected not for insufficient rigor, but for conclusions that challenged established attributions, questioning authenticity with evidence his supervisors found uncomfortably persuasive. The academic establishment, it seemed, preferred comfortable certainties to dangerous truths. Mrs. Catherine Morse revealed his persistent haunting of the library, accessing rare books through borrowed credentials with the determination of someone who refused to accept exile. Security footage confirmed nocturnal visits, timestamps speaking of systematic deception rather than casual rule-breaking. The night before Blackwood's death, cameras captured his entry at 11:47, a hooded figure moving with furtive purpose through corridors that should have remained forbidden to him. His studio apartment in Jericho breathed medieval obsession through every cramped surface. The air carried traces of cinnabar and lapis lazuli, centuries condensed into breathable atmosphere where genius and madness had learned uncomfortable cohabitation. Tables cluttered with glass vials containing historically accurate pigments shared space with modern spectroscopy equipment, while walls displayed enlarged manuscript photographs like devotional images. Chemical apparatus occupied surfaces beside medieval texts, the marriage of historical knowledge and contemporary technique creating possibilities that transcended mere forgery, approaching resurrection of lost arts through scientific precision. Lewis, whose appreciation for scholarship extends primarily to football statistics, nonetheless recognized the laboratory of someone who had transformed academic pursuit into practical obsession. Notebooks revealed systematic experimentation with binding agents, detailed analysis of aging processes, methodical documentation capable of creating manuscripts indistinguishable from authentic medieval works. His handwriting grew increasingly agitated across pages, excitement transforming into desperation as rejection followed rejection, academic doors closing against insights that challenged institutional comfort. In his desk drawer, beneath layers of correspondence, lay an abandoned letter addressed to Blackwood, its salutation intact but body interrupted after one revealing line. "You have forced me to actions that neither of us would have chosen." The sentence hung incomplete, confession abandoned by second thoughts or perhaps by events that rendered words inadequate to circumstance. On his windowsill, a crossword puzzle bore witness to interrupted leisure, half completed in pencil that grew darker toward the center. One clue caught my attention. Copyist's heart reversed to make truth visible, 7. The answer presented itself without effort. Forgery, where the forger's heart becomes visible through reversal of authentic intention. Even in recreation, Aldrich's obsessions announced themselves. The evidence assembled itself with disturbing neatness. Technical knowledge, desperate motive, confirmed access, life already half-lived in the chemical fog between reverence and reproduction. He possessed understanding sufficient to create the sophisticated forgeries we had discovered, and Blackwood's exposure would have obliterated any hope of academic redemption. The red mark on the library wall now seemed defiant signature, challenge thrown down by frustrated genius who had confused replication with resurrection. Yet something troubled the emerging pattern, some detail that refused alignment with apparent certainty. Aldrich's notebooks showed meticulous attention to historical accuracy, reverence for medieval techniques suggesting preservation rather than exploitation as motivation. His rejected thesis had argued for authentication rather than questioned it, seeking protection for genuine works rather than creating false ones for profit. The very perfection of the case against him stirred quiet unease. Life and death rarely present themselves with such convenient clarity. In Oxford's rain-darkened streets, I contemplated how brilliance and instability might mask innocence rather than guilt, wondering whether we had discovered our forger or merely another victim of circumstances that demanded scapegoats more than solutions. The arrest warrant waited on my desk like a prayer offered to the wrong saint, its formal language prepared to transform suspicion into legal certainty with bureaucratic efficiency. Yet in those quiet hours before dawn when conscience speaks most honestly, something whispered resistance against conclusions that arrived too neatly packaged. I'd learned to distrust evidence that fell into patterns with the suspicious tidiness of fiction rather than the untidy complexity of human motivation and medieval scholarship intertwined. The detail emerged from academic records with the quiet insistence of facts that refuse convenient interpretation. Thomas Aldrich suffered from deuteranomaly, red-green color blindness that rendered him incapable of distinguishing the subtle variations between crimson and brown, vermilion and ochre, the precise discriminations upon which convincing manuscript forgery depended. No forger, however brilliant his chemical knowledge, could create authentic-appearing illuminations while unable to perceive the delicate color relationships that separated genuine medieval pigments from modern approximations. The very expertise that had made him our prime suspect rendered him incapable of the crimes we had attributed to his frustrated genius. Memory retrieved that first examination in the rare books library with uncomfortable clarity, details that had seemed insignificant when observed now, demanding reinterpretation through this new understanding. Dr. Eliza Hartwell had identified the manuscript's blue pigment as lapis lazuli, her voice carrying professional authority that discouraged questioning. Yet any medieval specialist knew that lapis lazuli and ultramarine were identical, the same groundstone transformed into pigment through identical historical processes. Her error was not ignorance, but deliberate misdirection, expertise deployed to obscure rather than illuminate, knowledge perverted into weapon against truth itself. The realization arrived with the slow horror of understanding betrayal by those we trust most completely. Her intimate familiarity with Blackwood's research methods, his cryptic shorthand, his cross-lighting techniques, his habit of penciling abbreviations in manuscript margins before erasing them with his sleeve, spoke of collaboration that transcended professional courtesy. She had described his working patterns with the precision of someone who had observed them closely, repeatedly, in circumstances suggesting private access to his most personal scholarly rituals. I returned to Blackwood's office with the shame that attends belated clarity, searching among papers I had examined but not truly seen. Hidden within routine correspondence like confession disguised as business correspondence, the letter lay folded between manuscript photographs, its expensive paper bearing the particular texture chosen for intimate communication rather than official exchange. The handwriting flowed with feminine elegance, words arranged with the care of someone who understood that language could preserve emotion beyond its immediate expression. Her letter spoke of shared discoveries conducted in evening hours when the library's formal atmosphere dissolved into something more intimate, of manuscripts that revealed their secrets only to patient observation, of authentication work that had become collaboration between minds that understood each other with dangerous completeness. The tone suggested relationship that had evolved beyond professional partnership into emotional territory, where objectivity became impossible and betrayal inevitable. The signature proclaimed itself with elaborate decoration, an ornate E flourished in red ink that caught light with the same intensity as the mark on the library wall. The same hand that had written of love and scholarly passion had painted that final, terrible message beside Blackwood's body. The pigment matched not only in color but in the particular way it granulated and caught illumination. Speaking of identical materials applied by identical technique, medieval authenticity perverted into modern murder weapon. The crossword clue sanguine assumed profound significance when viewed through this new understanding. Blackwood had been optimistic about bloodshed, not his own, but the metaphorical violence of exposure, the academic carnage that would follow revelation of systematic deception within the medieval manuscripts collection. He had discovered not only forgeries, but the identity of their creator, someone whose expertise exceeded his own, whose access to authentic materials and intimate knowledge of authentication procedures made detection nearly impossible, until love itself became the betraying signature. In the library's hushed atmosphere, where centuries of knowledge breathed through carefully controlled air, I contemplated how scholarship could corrupt itself, how passion could transform into murder, how the very expertise meant to preserve cultural heritage could be perverted into instruments of deception and death, leaving truth bleeding in vermilion across ancient stone. The conservation laboratory possessed that particular silence where centuries speak through dust motes dancing in afternoon light, each speck a fragment of medieval vellum or Renaissance binding dissolved into breathable history. Dr. Eliza Hartwell stood beside an opened Annunciation manuscript, her fingers hovering above pigments that had outlasted empires while the truth around them crumbled with contemporary fragility. When I placed her letter on the examination table beside the illuminated text, she regarded both documents with identical professional composure, though her left hand betrayed tremor that no spectroscopy could measure. She acknowledged the handwriting without theatrical surprise, as though she had been expecting this confrontation since our first meeting in the Eagle and Child. Her admission arrived with the quiet dignity of those who understand that secrets, like medieval pigments, eventually reveal their true nature under sufficient examination. Yes, she confirmed, she had been Simon's lover for 3 years, their relationship developing with the slow intimacy of scholars who discover their minds complement each other across dangerous territory, where professional collaboration becomes personal devotion. Their partnership had transcended mere academic cooperation, she explained, evolving into shared investigation of systematic fraud within the medieval manuscripts collection. Simon possessed intuitive understanding of authentication that complemented her technical expertise, their combined knowledge creating synergy capable of detecting deceptions that might fool individual specialists. Together, they had identified forgeries sophisticated enough to survive casual examination, but revealing themselves to patient analysis conducted by minds that trusted each other completely. The plan had been methodical exposure, she continued, evidence accumulated through months of careful documentation before presentation to college authorities. Simon believed in institutional solutions, trusting that academic integrity would triumph once deception was properly revealed. But his final discovery had transformed scholarly concern into something approaching horror. The realization that their forger possessed intimate knowledge of authentication procedures, access to genuine materials, and expertise that could only belong to someone within their trusted circle of medieval specialists. Her voice carried the particular ache of betrayal by those we love most completely, describing how Simon's excitement had curdled into terror as evidence pointed toward conclusions neither had wanted to contemplate. The forger wasn't some external opportunist exploiting institutional trust, but someone whose scholarly reputation provided perfect camouflage for systematic deception, whose expertise made detection nearly impossible until love itself became the revealing signature that exposed truth hiding in plain sight. The red paint on the library wall had been Simon's final communication, she insisted, his dying message painted in pigments that would speak to anyone familiar with medieval practices. Blood had been incorporated into illuminated manuscripts, not merely as binding agent, but as symbolic element connecting artistic creation to spiritual sacrifice, authentication through literal incorporation of life itself. His mark referenced this tradition while pointing toward someone who would understand its significance, a medieval specialist whose knowledge encompassed both historical techniques and contemporary applications. but she denied killing him with quiet conviction that transcended legal convenience. She had arrived at the library to find him already collapsed, his final moments apparently spent in desperate attempt to leave evidence pointing toward his murderer. The red streak had been incomplete when she discovered his body, she claimed, requiring only final brush strokes to complete the message he had begun, with failing strength and fading consciousness. Yet forensic analysis suggested otherwise. The paint's chemical composition indicated single application rather than collaborative effort, and its direction revealed left-handed execution or right-handed awkwardness that belonged to no dying message. I watched her close a folder with her left hand, while her right hovered uncertainly, as though apologizing for deception. Crimson pigment lived beneath her fingernail with the persistence of secrets accustomed to being kept, medieval authenticity perverted into modern murder weapon. Her explanation carried emotional authenticity that might fool hearts but could not deceive evidence. In her laboratory, surrounded by instruments capable of revealing molecular truth, I contemplated how love could corrupt testimony as surely as hatred, how protection of the beloved dead might transform grief into complicity. She stood beside the Annunciation manuscript with hands that had painted devotional images, and perhaps something more terrible, her expertise encompassing both preservation and destruction, creation and murder disguised as natural death. The angel in the illumination gazed upward with expression suggesting knowledge too terrible for mortal comprehension, while Mary's downcast eyes spoke of acceptance that transcended understanding. Both figures trapped in pigments that would outlast empires, while secrets dissolved around them like medieval gold exposed to modern chemistry. Oxford possesses that peculiar talent for absorbing secrets into its ancient stones, as though centuries of accumulated discretion could transform scandal into mere historical footnote. The Master's Lodge breathed institutional memory through every carefully preserved detail. Portraits gazing with inherited patience, silver candlesticks catching afternoon light, while pale crescents on the sideboard spoke of other treasures that had quietly departed. Professor Margaret Ashford received my questions with the practiced composure of someone accustomed to managing crises without acknowledging their existence, her voice carrying diplomatic weight earned through decades of academic politics. The archives surrendered their secrets with reluctant honesty. Onion skin carbons from the 1970s recording the Ashford family manuscript's journey from private collection to institutional treasure. Acquisition records walked tidily down yellowed pages, though one entry bore the faint hesitation of correction, a 7 becoming 1 in strokes so thin they required angled light to reveal their second thoughts. The college librarian apologized for dust that existed only in her imagination, while producing photographs taken before rebinding, images that would prove more revealing than their creators had intended. In my flat that evening, with Buck offering quiet companionship and the city settling into its familiar rhythms, I cross-referenced those photographs with auction catalogs whose glossy pages carried the particular perfume of money transformed into art. The results arrived with the uncomfortable clarity of betrayal, revealed through patient accumulation of evidence. Lot 46 at Sotheby's, a 15th century book of hours, property of a lady bearing wormholes that formed constellations like a child's drawing of Orion. Magdalene's supposedly identical manuscript displayed those same celestial punctures, stars aligned across centuries with mathematical precision that transcended coincidence. Another catalogue, another property of a lady, another historiated initial bearing the same fine crack along its lower serif. Not cousins sharing family resemblance, but identical twins separated by institutional fraud and private necessity. The Ashford family collection had been walking out through auction house doors while maintaining its official residence in climate-controlled cases. Originals replaced by forgeries sophisticated enough to fool casual inspection, but vulnerable to the kind of rigorous analysis that Blackwood had been conducting with increasing thoroughness. The Development Office records revealed the elegant arithmetic of systematic deception. Each auction date corresponded precisely with college building projects, the Ashford Seminar Room, refurbished cloister corridors, new bursary funds that transformed private liquidation into public philanthropy. Money had discovered methods of movement while appearing to remain stationary. Family treasures, financing institutional expansion through carefully orchestrated cycles where theft enabled generosity and fraud funded gratitude. Bank records confirmed the mechanism with bureaucratic precision. Transfers from holding companies whose beneficial ownership hid behind legal discretion had funded donations that maintained family reputation while concealing systematic liquidation of the collection that had originally established their scholarly legacy. Professor Ashford had been selling her own inheritance while simultaneously donating the proceeds, creating perfect camouflage where expertise provided access and administrative position enabled manipulation of authentication procedures. The motive crystallized with uncomfortable clarity when viewed through decades of careful reputation management and institutional relationship cultivation. Blackwood's authentication work had exposed anachronistic materials in manuscripts supposedly centuries old, evidence that would destroy not only personal reputation but criminal liability involving millions in fraudulent transactions. His threat of exposure carried implications beyond academic disgrace. Prison sentences, financial restitution, scholarly scandal that would transform respected master into cautionary tale about expertise corrupted by necessity. In a London exhibition brochure discovered among her papers, a discreet King Street stamp revealed recent attendance at auction house previews, while a Christie's cloakroom tag bore rain-blurred ink that spoke of regular visits to venues where family heirlooms found new homes. The evidence accumulated like medieval illumination, each detail adding color and definition to a picture whose final clarity demanded acknowledgement of truths too uncomfortable for institutional comfort. Late that night, examining auction photographs under magnification, I discovered the detail that transformed suspicion into certainty. A faint ghost of book-plate adhesive showed in raking light, the Ashford family crest more felt than seen, its shadow remaining loyal even after careful removal. The master's hand had been steady in its deceptions, and that steadiness had ultimately betrayed the very expertise it had served to conceal. The master's lodge breathed institutional memory through leather bindings and oil-darkened portraits, each volume and canvas contributing to centuries of accumulated authority where knowledge had learned to coexist with necessary compromises. Professor Margaret Ashford received me in her study with the composure of someone who had spent decades managing academic crises without acknowledging their existence. Her silver hair catching light from mullioned windows as rain whispered against diamond panes with the persistence of secret-seeking confession. The auction catalogues lay spread between us like evidence in a trial where verdict had already been determined by patient accumulation of facts. She examined the photographs with scholarly attention, her fingers tracing edges of images that documented her family's treasures, finding new homes while their institutional ghosts maintained residence in college cases. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the particular weariness of those who understand that explanations change nothing while confession might preserve some fragment of dignity. She acknowledged the systematic replacement with quiet precision, describing decades of careful stewardship where family heirlooms had been converted into institutional benefit through methods that transcended mere theft. The forgeries had been created with devotional attention to historical accuracy, she explained, her expertise ensuring that each reproduction honored medieval artistry while serving contemporary necessity. The college had benefited from donations funded by auction proceeds, creating elegant cycles where private liquidation enabled public philanthropy without compromising either family reputation or institutional integrity. Blackwood's investigation had threatened more than academic scandal, she continued. His rigorous authentication procedures, capable of exposing decades of careful deception while destroying relationships that had required lifetimes to cultivate. His heart condition was well known within the college community, she observed with clinical detachment, medication requirements that made confrontation particularly dangerous for someone whose cardiac stability depended upon avoiding excessive stress. Yet forensic analysis had rendered its quiet verdict. Beneath her carefully manicured fingernails, microscopic traces of crimson pigment clung with the persistence of evidence that refuses convenient disposal. The same medieval red that had marked the library wall lived in the crescents where nervous habits had driven authentic materials into flesh, creating testimony more reliable than any sworn statement. Her hands, which she had positioned carefully throughout our conversation, betrayed knowledge that transcended medical awareness. She had met him in the library that evening, she admitted, ostensibly to discuss his accusations in surroundings appropriate to scholarly discourse. His ultimatum had been delivered with characteristic directness. Confession or exposure, institutional embarrassment or criminal prosecution, choices that offered no acceptable alternatives for someone whose life had been devoted to protecting both family honor and college reputation. When reasoned argument failed to modify his position, other methods had become necessary. Her knowledge of his medication schedule had made the rest almost inevitable. She explained with the detached precision of someone describing experimental procedure rather than premeditated murder. Sufficient provocation might produce results that appeared entirely natural while serving necessary purposes. She had simply continued their conversation until his condition deteriorated beyond recovery, then painted her signature beside his body, a master illuminator's mark on her final, most terrible work. The red paint had been deliberate communication rather than random vandalism, she confirmed. Medieval pigment applied with techniques that honored historical tradition while proclaiming authorship to anyone possessing sufficient expertise to interpret the message. Like medieval monks who had incorporated blood into their illuminations, she had mixed authentic materials with contemporary purpose, creating testament that would outlast institutional memory. Her confession arrived without theatrical remorse or convenient breakdown, delivered with the quiet dignity of someone who had weighed alternatives and chosen the least damaging course available. She had protected the college's reputation and preserved her family's honor, she stated with matter-of-fact certainty, and given identical circumstances would make the same choices again. Institutional loyalty and ancestral obligation transcended individual conscience, creating duties that demanded sacrifice of lesser considerations for greater good. In that study, surrounded by centuries of accumulated wisdom and contemporary corruption, I contemplated how expertise could serve both preservation and destruction, how devotion to institutional ideals might justify methods that violated every principle such institutions claimed to embody. Outside, Oxford's ancient stones absorbed another secret with the patience of centuries, while inside, the weight of crimson stained more than manuscripts. It marked the soul of scholarship itself, where knowledge and betrayal had learned to illuminate the same page. Institutions possessed that peculiar talent for absorbing scandal into their ancient fabric, transforming crisis into administrative opportunity with the practiced efficiency of centuries. Committees had multiplied across Magdalen like careful ivy, each with its designated remit: authentication review, access protocols, ethics in acquisitions, their agendas typed on college letterhead that lent bureaucratic dignity to institutional embarrassment. Within a fortnight, procedures had been revised, protocols established, and recommendations drafted in language designed to prevent future irregularities without acknowledging past ones too explicitly. Professor Margaret Ashford's resignation arrived in a paragraph so courteously phrased, it almost apologized for meaning anything at all. Her departure was discussed in combination rooms with the delicate appetite of those who prefer speculation to its inevitable conclusion. Names spoken like incantations while fellows weighed energy against judgment, vision against prudence. The medieval manuscripts collection would require someone of unquestionable integrity, though voices carried undertones suggesting that excessive rigor might prove as problematic as insufficient vigilance. Oxford preferred its scholars brilliant, but not dangerously so. The reauthentication process proceeded with methodical thoroughness, genuine expertise finally applied without institutional pressure, corrupting professional judgment. Several manuscripts proved more valuable than originally assessed, their true provenance establishing connections to scriptoriums, previously known only through fragmentary records. A psalter, misattributed to a minor atelier, revealed itself as the work of a master hand, while one Book of Hours disclosed palimpsest text beneath devotional scenes. Invisible prayers that, once discovered, made the volume more precious than any donor's speech had dared suggest. Dr. Eliza Hartwell accepted Cambridge's offer with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that geography might provide healing where time alone could not. Every medieval text at Magdalen would forever echo with Simon's voice, she explained when I encountered her clearing her office, each illuminated manuscript a reminder of conversations that had begun in scholarship and ended in betrayal. Her desk bore pale rings where mugs had lived, while an eraser worn to crescents lay abandoned in the drawer. Small archaeology of a life interrupted by tragedy. The Eagle and Child received me with familiar indifference, its atmosphere unchanged by recent revelations about academic integrity's fragility. The same reproduction, Turner, bled ancient reds toward copper above the bar, while diamond-paned windows cast amber light across scarred oak where my crossword lay half-conquered. Tonight's puzzle offered fresh torment. Scholar's final mark, Crimson Heritage, 9. I stared at the grid, thinking of signatures painted in medieval pigments, of expertise perverted into instruments of murder. Lewis arrived with rain in his cuffs, and that permanent expression of someone who had accepted the world's comedy without applauding it. The Renaissance Revelations exhibition would proceed as planned, he informed me, though now featuring a memorial dedication to Simon Blackwood's contributions to medieval scholarship. The college had decided his authentication work deserved recognition despite circumstances surrounding his death. Institutional memory already transforming tragedy into inspiration for future scholars. I thought of illuminated manuscripts and the medieval monks who had created beauty designed to outlast empires, mixing gold leaf with pigments that included their own blood, literal incorporation of life into art that would speak across centuries to minds they could never imagine. Their devotion had been pure in ways contemporary scholarship struggled to achieve, knowledge pursued for its own sake rather than as instrument for personal advancement or institutional aggrandizement. Modern scholars had mixed different substances for different purposes, reputation with deception, authenticity with fraud, expertise with murder. The crossword clue suddenly yielded its meaning. Signature, the scholar's final mark rendered in crimson heritage, medieval tradition corrupted to serve contemporary necessity. Professor Ashford had signed her ultimate work not with ink, but with pigment that honored historical techniques while serving murderous purpose. Lewison mentioned that Development Office had already drafted new paragraphs about the collection's enhanced reputation. Institutional machinery converting scandal into opportunity with practiced efficiency. When he asked if I felt satisfaction, I replied that truth rarely grants such indulgence, preferring instead to leave questions that resist comfortable answers. Outside, Oxford's ancient stones absorbed another secret with geological patience, adding this tragedy to their endless palimpsest of human ambition and frailty. Rain whispered against windows with promises of cleansing that would remain unfulfilled, while inside, conversations continued about matters that seemed important until measured against the weight of accumulated history and the persistence of human nature unchanged by education or enlightenment. The Turner held its small fire above us, and somewhere behind walls that pretended not to listen, the city gathered another story that no commemorative plaque would ever tell.